the Galactic Educational Consortium's crown jewel. The Academy of Advanced Civilizational Studies on Zen-3 Prime represented everything sophisticated about interstellar society. Its crystalline spires caught 3 different suns at precisely calculated angles. Its gravity fields maintained perfect 0.7 G throughout its corridors, and its admission standards were so rigorous that entire star systems bragged about having a single student accepted. The Academy prided itself on molding the galaxy's future leaders from the finest specimens of civilized species, which made the presence of humans there something of an embarrassing clerical error that nobody wanted to address directly. The consortium species classification system, developed over millennia of careful xenobiological study, ranked worlds on a scale of I through 15 based on environmental hostility. Class 1 worlds were paradises where the biggest threat might be a mildly aggressive flower. Class 15 worlds were actively trying to murder everything on them through creative combinations of radiation, predators, weather, and geology. Earth, naturally, had earned itself a solid Class 12 rating, placing humans firmly in the Deathworlder category alongside other species that most civilized beings preferred to observe from a safe distance. The scholarship program that had brought 12-year-old Kai Mitchell to Zen-3 Prime was a result of a bureaucratic compromise born from political necessity. The Terran Federation had been making uncomfortable noises about representation in galactic institutions, and somebody in the consortium's diversity office had decided that admitting one human child would demonstrate their commitment to inclusivity while being statistically insignificant enough to ignore. Nobody had bothered to inform the teaching staff about the finer points of Deathworlder physiology. Instructor Vex Thana belonged to the crystalline hegemony, a species that had evolved from living minerals on a world where the most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive moss. His people had developed intelligence, philosophy, and an unshakable conviction that proper education required discipline, structure, and the occasional physical correction when students proved insufficiently receptive to knowledge. This approach worked wonderfully with crystalline younglings, whose silicon-based bodies could absorb impacts that would shatter lesser materials. The morning of what would later be remembered as the Zen-3 incident began with Vex Thana in an already irritated mood. His advanced theoretical physics class contained the usual collection of promising young minds from respectable civilizations, 3 Altaran nobles whose families traced their lineage back to the First Galactic Congress, a pair of Fluffian twins whose species had mastered faster than light travel while most others were still discovering fire, and one human child who seemed determined to question everything. Kai Mitchell sat in the back row, which was both a practical necessity due to the size differences between species and a social reality that nobody discussed openly. His human standard desk looked oddly primitive next to the hovering crystal matrices and neural link stations his classmates used, but the consortium's budget for accommodating Deathworlders extended exactly as far as providing furniture that wouldn't collapse under Earth normal gravity. The lesson of the day covered gravitational field manipulation, a fundamental technology that any civilized species mastered shortly after achieving spaceflight. Vex Thana's crystalline form caught the classroom's ambient light as he gestured toward equations that floated in holographic splendor above his lectern. The relationship between mass distortion and spatial curvature follows a precise mathematical constant, Vex Thana intoned, his voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that crystallites used to convey absolute certainty. This constant, designated as theta prime, represents the fundamental limit of reality's flexibility. Most of the students dutifully recorded this information in whatever format their species preferred. The Altarans hummed softly as data flowed directly into their expanded memory cortexes. The Fluffians first shifted colors to indicate comprehension and filing priority. Kai raised his hand. Vex Thana's optical senses dimmed slightly, which was the crystalline equivalent of a resigned sigh. Yes, Mitchell. The constant you're showing assumes uniform density distribution, but what happens when you factor in quantum fluctuations at the event horizon? Wouldn't that create recursive instabilities that make the whole equation meaningless for practical applications? The classroom fell silent. Even the Fluffians first stopped its gentle color cycling. Vex Thana's form brightened, which was definitely not a good sign. The equation is fundamental, Mitchell. It has been verified by every major civilization for over 3,000 standard years. Perhaps humans simply lack the cognitive architecture to appreciate mathematical elegance. But the math doesn't work, Kai persisted, pulling up his own calculations on his primitive tablet. Look, if you run the simulation with realistic parameters instead of ideal conditions. Enough. Vexthana's harmonic frequency shifted into registers that made several students uncomfortable. The arrogance of Deathworlders never ceases to amaze me. You've been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries, yet you presume to correct mathematics developed by civilizations that mastered the stars when your species was discovering agriculture. Kai's tablet beeped softly as his simulation completed. Actually, I think your civilizations made a calculation error about 3,000 years ago, and everyone's been copying it ever since. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and argued over by xenobiologists, legal scholars, and military strategists for decades to come. In his crystalline fury at being corrected by what he considered barely evolved fauna, Vexthana moved with a swift precision that his species used to discipline their young. His arm swept forward in a motion calculated to deliver exactly enough force to cause temporary disorientation without permanent damage to a crystalline child. Unfortunately, Kai Mitchell was not a crystalline child. The blow caught Kai across the left side of his face and sent him tumbling from his chair to the floor. For a moment, the only sound in the classroom was the soft hum of the gravity generators and Kai's sharp intake of breath. Then the human child sat up, one hand pressed to his rapidly swelling cheek, and said, "Oh, that really hurt." Vexthana stared down at him, optical sensors cycling through confusion. Crystalline younglings typically responded to such correction by acknowledging their error and returning to their seats. They certainly didn't develop those alarming color changes that were spreading across the human skin. "Your face is turning purple," observed Zywxana, one of the Fluffian twins, her fur shifting to worried yellow patterns. "Are you dying?" "No, it's just bruising," Kai said, climbing back into his chair with the casual resilience that characterized his species. "It'll heal in a few days." Zywxana's fur went completely white, which was the Fluffian equivalent of abject horror. "A few days? How are you even conscious?" The other students began murmuring in their various ways. The Alteran's harmonic discussion sounded like a dirge. The second Fluffian twin had fainted entirely, her fur cycling through distress patterns that triggered the classroom's medical alert system. Vexthana found himself in the uncomfortable position of having administered what he considered routine discipline, only to discover that he had apparently inflicted catastrophic injury on a student. The human child showed no signs of the severe neurological damage that such visible trauma would indicate in any civilized species, but clearly something was terribly wrong. "Perhaps you should report to the medical center," Vexthana suggested, his voice carrying harmonics of confusion rather than authority. "I'm fine," Kai insisted, though the bruising continued to develop in patterns that made his classmates increasingly agitated. "Can we get back to the math? Because I really think there's an error in that equation." Before Vexthana could respond, Zywxana's tablet chimed with an incoming message. Her sister had apparently recovered from a fainting spell, and, in the way of traumatized teenagers throughout the galaxy, had immediately documented the crisis. The image she captured would later be classified by military analysts as a weapon of mass psychological warfare, though that designation would prove to be entirely accidental. It showed Kai Mitchell sitting calmly in his chair, one side of his face displaying the kind of injury patterns that would indicate imminent death in most galactic species, while apparently suffering no ill effects whatsoever. Zywxana, still processing her own shock, uploaded the image to the Academy's student network with a caption that roughly translated as "Human child nearly murdered in physics class, continues taking notes." The student network connected to university systems across 17 star systems. Those systems linked to academic networks that spanned the galaxy. Within 6 hours, the image had been viewed by approximately 40 billion sentient beings, most of whom reached the same logical conclusion. The humans were far more terrifying than anyone had realized. Dr. Yilthara of the Celestial Medical Institute was among the first xenobiologists to analyze the image. Her preliminary report, hastily distributed to medical facilities across 3 sectors, concluded that the human child was displaying trauma patterns consistent with severe cranial damage and imminent cognitive failure. The fact that the subject appeared functional was attributed to unknown Deathworlder physiological adaptations that temporarily mask fatal injuries. This report reached the Altaïran Council of Healers, who immediately issued a statement declaring the image evidence of systematic abuse of an incredibly fragile species masquerading as resilient Deathworlders. The council demanded immediate intervention by galactic authorities to prevent what they termed the genocide of beings so delicate that routine disciplinary measures prove lethal. The Fluffy in Assembly, still processing their own trauma from having witnessed the incident through their children's reports, passed a resolution condemning the casual brutalization of entities whose apparent durability conceals critical weaknesses. They demanded reparations for what they characterized as a war crime against a species that had clearly been misclassified as Deathworlders when they were actually among the most vulnerable beings in the galaxy. Meanwhile, on 17 different worlds, parents frantically contacted their children studying at the academy to ensure they hadn't witnessed similar atrocities. The resulting communications surge crashed 3 separate interstellar networks and triggered emergency protocols designed to handle invasion scenarios. The Terran Federation first learned about the crisis when Ambassador Chen received an urgent communication from the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Division. The message, marked with priority codes typically reserved for extinction-level events, requested immediate clarification of humanity's acceptable casualty parameters for educational incidents involving human juveniles. Ambassador Chen stared at the message for several minutes before requesting clarification. The response included the now famous image of Kai Mitchell, along with detailed medical analyses from 12 different species explaining why the child's injuries were clearly fatal and demanding to know whether humanity intended to declare war over the incident. "He looks fine to me," Chen observed to his aide, Lieutenant Park. "Bit of a shiner, but nothing serious. Should I contact the medical staff on Zen 3 Prime to confirm his condition?" Park suggested. "Probably a good idea. And maybe we should send a message explaining that human children are quite a bit more durable than other species seem to think." This message, intended as a routine diplomatic clarification, was interpreted by nervous alien governments as a terrifying revelation about human physiology. If injuries that would prove fatal to their children were considered minor to humans, then what exactly were they dealing with? The crystalline hegemony, facing accusations of attempted murder, immediately recalled all their citizens from human space. The Altaïran Republic issued travel advisories warning their people that humans were significantly more dangerous than previously assessed. The Fluffy in Assembly began developing new protocols for interacting with beings who could apparently survive trauma that would kill civilized species. On Zen 3 Prime, Kai Mitchell continued attending classes, largely unaware that his bruised face had triggered the largest diplomatic crisis in galactic history. The swelling had begun to subside, which his alien classmates interpreted as either miraculous healing or the onset of some unknown Deathworlder condition that was even more horrifying than initially suspected. Vexthana found himself summoned before emergency tribunals on 3 different worlds, each demanding explanations for his assault on what they now understood to be an incredibly fragile being disguised as a resilient Deathworlder. His attempts to explain that he had used only routine disciplinary force were met with horror and disbelief. "You struck a human child with enough force to cause that level of trauma and expected them to survive," demanded Councillor Zethrix of the Altaïran Judicial Review. "The force was calibrated for crystalline physiology," Vexthana protested. "It was barely sufficient to cause momentary discomfort to one of our younglings." "And yet look at the results," Zethrix replied, displaying the image of Kai's injuries. "This level of damage would require emergency surgery for any civilized species." The fact that the human child remained conscious suggests either superhuman pain tolerance or severe neurological shock. Similar conversations were taking place across the galaxy, as governments tried to understand what they had gotten themselves into by admitting humans to galactic society. Military analysts began developing new threat assessments based on the assumption that a species capable of surviving such injuries in childhood was probably capable of surviving almost anything in adulthood. The crisis reached its peak when the Galactic Defense Consortium detected unusual activity in human space. Earth's routine mining operations and research missions, previously ignored as the activities of a minor Deathworlder civilization, were suddenly interpreted as massive military mobilizations. When 3 human cargo vessels changed course to investigate an asteroid anomaly, 12 alien governments assumed they were witnessing the beginning of a punitive invasion. Emergency evacuation orders went out across 4-star systems. The consortium's finest military minds began developing strategies for dealing with an enemy that could apparently ignore injuries that would incapacitate their own forces. If human children could survive near-fatal trauma and continue functioning normally, what kind of damage could human adults absorb? The answer came when Ambassador Chen finally managed to establish direct communication with the Galactic Council's emergency session. His appearance via hologram interrupted heated debates about mobilizing defensive fleets and implementing quarantine protocols around human space. "I understand there's been some concern about one of our students," Chen began, his tone carrying the diplomatic calm that came from years of dealing with interstellar misunderstandings. "Concern?" Counselor Prexstar, the geometric collective's voice, carried harmonic frequencies that indicated barely controlled panic. "Your child was brutally assaulted and nearly killed, yet your government's response has been minimal. Are you planning some form of retaliation that our senses cannot detect?" Chen blinked. "Retaliation? For what?" "The systematic abuse of your incredibly fragile offspring by our educational institutions," clarified Counselor Yethana of the Fluffian Assembly. "We understand that species pride may prevent you from admitting weakness, but surely the near murder of a human child demands some response." "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding," Chen replied, pulling up the medical report he'd received from Zen3 Prime. Young Kai Mitchell suffered minor bruising from an inappropriate disciplinary action. He's been cleared for full activities and is back in class. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of communication arrays across 17 different worlds. Minor bruising. Prexstar's harmonic frequency shifted into ranges that human ears couldn't detect, but that clearly indicated profound confusion. "That's correct. The injury looked worse than it was due to human circulatory patterns. Our children are quite resilient." "But the trauma patterns," Yethana protested. "The visible damage." "Superficial," Chen confirmed. "Painful, certainly, and the instructor's actions were inappropriate, but not life-threatening. Human children recover from such injuries quickly." Another silence, longer this time. "Are you telling us," Prexstar said slowly, "that what our medical experts classified as near-fatal trauma is considered minor by human standards?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The implications hit the assembled governments with the force of a relativistic projectile. If humans could survive as children what would kill adults of most species, then the galaxy's entire understanding of Deathworlder physiology required immediate revision. Over the following weeks, as the crisis gradually de-escalated and evacuated populations returned to their worlds, xenobiologists worked frantically to develop new classifications for human durability. The revelation that Earth's inhabitants were significantly more resilient than previously understood triggered a complete revision of interspecies safety protocols. Kai Mitchell, meanwhile, completed his semester at the academy with grades that would have been impressive from any student, regardless of species. His physics project, which demonstrated the mathematical errors in several fundamental equations that had been accepted as fact for millennia, earned him recognition from the Galactic Institute of Theoretical Sciences. Instructor Vexthana found his career taking an unexpected turn when he was appointed to head the newly created Department of Deathworlder Studies, tasked with developing educational approaches suitable for species whose children could survive impacts that would prove lethal to crystalline adults. His first lecture, Understanding Resilient Physiology in Educational Settings, was attended by representatives from 47 different worlds. The irony was not lost on galactic observers that the most significant advancement in interspecies understanding in decades had resulted from one alien educator's momentary loss of temper and one human child's remarkable ability to walk off what most of the galaxy considered a death sentence. The Academy of Advanced Civilizational Studies quietly updated its admission materials to include detailed physiological requirements for each species, along with strict guidelines for appropriate disciplinary measures. They also added a new course to their curriculum, Cross-Species Interaction and the Dangers of Assumptions. And in a development that surprised no one who understood bureaucratic psychology, applications from human students increased by 300% the following year, as word spread throughout Terran space about the excellent education available at an institution that had accidentally demonstrated just how tough human children really were. The galaxy, it seemed, had learned an important lesson about the dangers of underestimating Deathworlders, even the small ones. Especially the small ones. As for Kai Mitchell, he graduated with honors and went on to study advanced physics at the Galactic Institute, where his professors had been carefully briefed on appropriate interaction protocols for resilient species. His thesis on gravitational field manipulation contained corrections to 17 fundamental equations, and he never once got hit by an instructor. Though he did keep a small scar on his cheek as a reminder of the day his bruised face accidentally terrorized half the galaxy.